Oh, hi everyone. Guess who's back? Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, the radical, revolutionary man who's, well, scientist, who's actually rewriting the history of the human race. And Dr. Jeanson, we're doing this series, and you've done an incredible amount of research. And because of all your genetics background and so on, you have a series of presentations you're giving. And this really leads up to the publication of a new book in 2021. But you're calling this series The New History of the Human Race, and we're much more related than we think. And so part 3 that you gave last night, you talked about were the ancient Persians black in quotes, in other words, dark. Now this one, how to silently take over a country. Now that does sound revolutionary, how to silently take over a country. Could most of Europe have had recent African ancestry? Might most Caucasians have had dark-skinned ancestors for thousands of years? Man, this is going to have all sorts of political ramifications here. I can see that. But anyway, it is over to you for part 4.
Yes, we often think of our nationalities, ethnicities in tight, defined boxes and assume it's always been that way. And you look at genetics and all those dearly cherished ideas get blown to smithereens. But it gets blown to smithereens because the only way you can really answer these is either you've got a long family history that has been documented, which there's nothing we can do about. We have to have ancestors who decided, well, I'm going to write down who I came from. Most people haven't. So in absent that, you can then look at genetics, or you can look at some of the indirect clues, which is what we've been doing the past 3 episodes. And we'll look at one more now. And part of the reason I've been taking this approach again is when we do look at the genetics in detail, some of the stuff is so shocking and hard to believe. This plows the ground a little bit to see, okay, I can see how it works. I never would have thought it would have worked that way, but it does play out this way. So this is the new history of the human race. And we're going to uncover some really, really revolutionary things about the history of who we came from. And that's the main question, that all of this is revolving around who were our ancestors? How do we connect to one another? Is it like the history books say, or as they imply, that people kind of pop into existence and then disappear and there's no connections among them? Obviously, that's not true, but that's kind of the way it's presented. And that's the way it's presented because we haven't had genetic data until now. Even the research I've been doing, this is really new within just the past few years that we've come to these conclusions. It's also helped us answer the question of what happened to these civilizations and how do they relate to you and me? Could we have some of these famous, glorious civilizations, the people there, as part of our own family tree? And we've seen increasing evidence that what we take for granted is not true. I used to think that the ancient peoples were the ancestors of the modern ones, the ancient Greeks, the ancestors of the modern Greeks, and I found this is not true. And part of the clues to that conclusion come from looking at the history of human population growth. The world is smaller than we think, fewer somebodies in the past than the present, in a dramatic way. And then when we trace our individual family trees backward, we do the math, you can't go back indefinitely. You can't keep doubling your number of ancestors every generation. Just a few hundred years ago, there's more ancestors in theory in my family tree than people alive. Can't be true. So my mother and father must be more related to each other than I'm used to thinking about and maybe comfortable with. Me and my spouse, my wife, must be more related to each other than we think, maybe are comfortable with. And ultimately, this isn't just something unique to one ethnicity or another. At some point, these ethnic groups have to start combining. That's what the math implies. We saw that genetics makes this extremely possible. You can go from one very defined, taken for granted ethnicity and become another one in just a few generations. And today we want to look at how to silently take over a country and how easy this is to do with just a few considerations. Is it possible that most of Europe has in their family tree recent African ancestry? Could it be that most of Europe traces back to the Africans just a few hundred years ago? And when we think about African ancestry, especially for our American viewing audience, there's a history that comes to mind first. A sad history, the history of the transatlantic slave trade, for which we have a tremendous amount of data. I want to start there before I move on to a neglected slave trade, that has potentially bigger impact on Europe. So for Americans, people of dark skin, by and large, are the result of the transatlantic slave trade. It begins around the 1500s. 12 million Africans were loaded onto these ships against their will. Over 1 million died in transit. 10.7 million arrive in the Americas. And this comes from logbooks of the slave ships. We have fairly detailed documentation for this in the mainstream community. This isn't really something that's disputed. It's a very sad history. Now, in terms of where in the Americas people ended up, we again have detailed documentation for this. A large chunk of people, and I've drawn these arrows appropriate to the population size, a large proportion of that 10.7 million ends up in South America. Another chunk ends up in the Caribbean and the West Indies. And I've been surprised to learn that only a small fraction ends up going directly to North America, which of course I live, Ken lives, many of our viewers probably live. And an even tinier fraction, less than 9,000, are brought to Europe. Now, if you think about the purposes for the transatlantic slave trade back then, in a sense, it makes sense. The gender ratio makes sense. Twice as many men as women were brought over. And the purpose, of course, was to work in the fields. We'll talk about the history of the Americas around the time of the arrival of the Europeans and prior to that in much more detail in future episodes. For our purposes right now, though, when the Europeans came over, there's many of the conquistadors and such, the Portuguese, the Spanish came over looking for gold, plunder, so forth, and to extract usefulness from the land. So eventually it turns into having plantations in the tropical areas, sugarcane and so forth. The intention, I think, was to enslave the native peoples. They underwent a dramatic population collapse due to introduced diseases, overworking, so forth, the culture collapse. And so Africans then were brought over to essentially take their place in the fields. That's the sad history. And it begins around the 1500s. So Columbus arrives in 1492. I think it's the Portuguese ships that come around the west coast of Africa, and things don't take that long to get into full swing. And if you look at the year by year data, you can see in this graph that it's a trickle of slaves coming over in the 1500s to 1600. In 1600 it begins to pick up some more, and you can see that the bulk of the slave trade happened 1700, early 1800s, and it drops off quickly as legislation is introduced. In Britain and Brazil, the specific end to the slave trade varies by country, as it's a result of when people pass anti-slavery laws. The legacy of all this, of course, is seen in the populations of the Americas today. If you look at the 2010 US Census data and how people list their race, so to speak, of course, we're not talking in an accurate sense per se. Race is simply different shades of brown, as we emphasize over and over again. It's worth repeating. The racial categories we invent and use to put people down and elevate people are an artifact and a consequence of man's depraved nature. But when we think of dark skin, light skin, often called black and white, the majority of the US, of course, still says white, but over 10% now would say black, and these are the descendants, again, the offspring of those who came over during the slave trade. This is probably more detailed than what people are familiar with, but the concept is something that rings a bell for many Americans. What's less well known, because it historically precedes it, and perhaps because of politics, is another African slave trade. Quite shockingly, this slave trade involved about the same number of people, 11.5 million Africans enslaved. The gender ratio was reversed because the purpose was different. There was still, and I'm getting to who these people were doing the enslaving, there was still some field work that they were recruiting slaves, and I'll say who the they is in a minute. But the primary purpose was household labor, household servitude, and women for their harems. So that's why there's this 2-to-1 females to males ratio in this neglected slave trade. It began in the 600s and went through the 1800s. So instead of lasting just 300, 350 years like the transatlantic slave trade, it lasts 12 centuries. And the geography of this slave trade is oriented differently. Obviously, if this is the 600s and the old world, Europe, Asia, isn't even aware that the new world, the Americas, exists, they're not going to be sending slaves there. Instead, this is across the Sahara into Europe, into the Middle East and such. And so now that you know the direction, our viewers might begin to guess as to who this is. And of course, if you know your history and dates, you might have a guess as well. Shaded in red here is some of the geographic realm of this kingdom and series of kingdoms. What I'm talking about, of course, is the Islamic slave trade. Muhammad arises in the 600s, begins conquest in the Arabian Peninsula, which is modern Saudi Arabia and such, Oman, Yemen. And his followers eventually begin to conquer North Africa, Middle East. They reach Spain. They're in Spain for hundreds of years. In fact, in about the 700s, the Islamic raiders and people pursuing an Islamic kingdom arrive in the Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula. They're there for several hundred years. They aren't finally pushed back out until after Columbus arrives in the New World. So they're sitting in the America, not just the Arabian Muslims, but their slaves are sitting in Europe for hundreds of years. And a lot of the slave trade even continues into the 1800s. So if you think about the 1800s, the dominant Muslim kingdom that is reaching into Europe is on the other side of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, think 14, 15, 1600s. It's into the Balkan Peninsula, modern Greece and Bulgaria and such. And they even last into World War I. I'm more familiar with World War II, but if you think of the dominant powers at the time, the Ottoman Empire is there on the scene. So this whole time, 12 centuries, you've got slaves moving from sub-Saharan Africa into the Islamic kingdoms. They're bringing people with them where they go. You've got Africans now in Europe. What is the legacy of this centuries-long, over a millennium-long slave trade? What I want to do to answer that question is run through some hypothetical scenarios. We'll make them as realistic as possible to see what a small difference between African descent people and Caucasian descent people can translate to in the modern day. So I'm just going to pick the year 1400 as a good starting point. 1400 is after the Black Death has wiped out perhaps 30% of Europe. So there's a big population loss there. It comes from the east. So in AD 1400, the population has dropped to about 60 million Europeans. And let's say, just for sake of argument, these are all Caucasians, because I want to run a hypothetical scenario with that, just to give you a sense for, with maybe a more extreme case, what a less extreme case would look like. So let's say there's 60 million Caucasian Europeans. So the number 60 million comes from historical documentation. It's a number that you can see in published works on historical population sizes. I'm also going to say, just for sake of argument, that there were 60,000 African slaves. That's a number I'm just pulling out of a hat, saying, what if there was just a small fraction? We know that there's Islamic empires in Europe, Spain and so forth, that was there. They're still not kicked out of Spain in AD 1400. They've been there for hundreds of years. So let's say they had 60,000 African slaves with them, or maybe that the African slaves eventually gave rise to this number of people. My point here is just to say, what if a small fraction of Europe consists of African descent peoples? So just to give you a sense for what a dramatic difference this is, 60 million versus 60,000, what I'm saying is in AD 1400, just for fun, let's say there's 99.9% of Europe is Caucasian, and only 0.1% is dark-skinned African descent because of the Islamic slave trade. What sort of consequence, what sort of legacy would it leave in Europe? Could the African people take over Europe silently? In a sense, it's a much bigger scenario we're running of what we discussed in the previous episode, thinking of individual family trees like my own and my wife's. So I'm saying at this point, given the numbers I just described in the previous slide, 1 out of every 1,000 people in Europe is dark-skinned. So if you're just wandering through Europe in AD 1400, you're not going to run into a dark-skinned person much at all. They represent just a small fraction. So what legacy might they have going forward? Let's say that for the 60 million Europeans, we give them a modest birth rate. Not a high one, just a modest one. And let's say for the peoples of African descent, we give them a modest but slightly higher birth rate. Let's say that on average, they have 20% more children. It's not a big difference. And to illustrate this, let's put some real numbers on this. Let's say that the people of Caucasian descent, let's say there's 10 dads of Caucasian descent, they have 10 sons. That's population replacement. I'm going to change these numbers a little bit, but this is a good starting point because it's numbers we can wrap our minds around and put on the screen. 20% more would mean the African descent people have 12 sons. So to look at it visually, tangibly, you've got dark-skinned peoples, light-skinned peoples. This difference in reproductive rate would look like that. And in fact, I gave one of these slides to a person to make prettier, and they didn't even notice that there was a difference between the left side of the screen and the right side. You're wandering through Europe, and there's 60 million Caucasian Europeans. They have a modest birth rate. The people of African descent have just a little bit more. You probably wouldn't even notice it. I don't think anyone would have written this down. My point here is it's silent, nearly. So what happens next? We talked about in our previous episode for an individual family tree, if you've got an African who's part of a family tree where the vast majority of people are light-skinned, he's likely to marry someone who's of light skin, and so the next generation is of middle brown skin tone. This is genetics we covered in the last episode. So I'm going to change the lower left part of the screen to reflect the genetic reality. They're probably middle brown skin tone is the offspring. Okay, let's change these modest numbers that are easier to wrap our minds around to something a little bit more realistic. So population replacement, 10 dads with 10 sons means the Caucasian population doesn't grow. Let's give them some growth. So I'm going to change this to 100 dads have 110 sons. I've bumped these numbers up because I don't want to talk about fractions. We don't have half a son. I want to have whole numbers. So 100 dads have 110 sons. It's a slow growth rate. 20% more means 100 African descent dads have 132 sons. So now let's convert this to absolute numbers. We said in AD 1400, there's 60 million Caucasian descent, 60,000 African descent. What that means is the Caucasian descent people would have 66 million Caucasian offspring. The African descent were just below 80,000. So once again, even though they have a slightly higher birth rate, they're still the overwhelming minority. There's an overwhelming majority of light-skinned peoples. And even their offspring, I'm saying here, most likely would be middle brown. The generation in the lower half of this screen becomes the ancestors of the next generation. They're the parents now. What would their children look like? Same song, second verse. Once again, the people of middle brown are likely going to marry Caucasian peoples because they're still around 0.1% or so. There's still tens of millions of Caucasian people. So their offspring are likely going to be lighter skin tone. So you repeat this next generation. These become the ancestors of the next generation, the lower half of the screen, ancestors of the next generation. And in just a few generations, as we covered in our last episode, you can get light-skinned peoples. So the genetics is the same. What I'm altering for this episode is the numbers to see what a little difference in reproductive rates can do. So let's say this difference in reproductive rates that, again, no one would probably even notice, wouldn't bat an eye. What if this continues for several hundred years? What happens by the time you get to 1975? Again, everyone's probably going to look Caucasian. Even though you had some dark-skinned peoples back then, they're in a overwhelming sea of light-skinned peoples, yet they're producing more offspring. Again, because of the genetics, they eventually are light-skinned. But the peoples of African descent, if they kept their genealogy, would then by 1975 represent 6% of the population. A small difference in reproductive rates over multiple generations can produce pretty big long-term effects. So to go from 0.1% to 6% is a pretty big jump. Now, viewers might look at the right side of the screen and say 99% to 94%, big deal. It's still an overwhelming sea of light-skinned people, some of whom happen to have an African ancestry. Well, think about this. In AD 1400, I said the peoples of African descent were 1 out of 1,000. AD 75, they're now 1 out of 17, 6%. You're much more likely now to encounter someone of African descent. You might not know it because they're light-skinned, but that's the reality of running these numbers. Now, let's take it one step further. The Islamic slave trade didn't start in AD 1400. I said it starts when Muhammad begins his conquests shortly thereafter. He starts in the 600s. Let's double the length of time this difference in reproductive rate can occur. So I said from AD 1400 to 1975 produces these numbers. That's a length of time of 575 years. let's double that length of time. Go backwards 575 years, and so make this even longer. Let's say this sort of difference happened beginning in 825 AD. By then, the Muslims were in Spain. Let's say in 825, the first African descent peoples, Islamic slave trade peoples, dark-skinned peoples, come over to Spain and begin reproducing, and they have a slightly higher reproductive rate than the Caucasian descent peoples. And this sort of difference lasts for twice 575 years. So it lasts from 825 to 1975. What happens then? How many people in Europe would be of African descent? The majority of peoples in this scenario in Europe would be light-skinned, but of African descent, because of a small difference in reproductive rates. This math is not intuitive, but hopefully what you've seen is I've just given you a historically plausible scenario, one that's going to be very hard to know yay or nay. Who records for a millennium a 20% difference in reproductive rates? It's very possible, not something you notice. You can easily have most of Europe be of African descent. The only way to know for sure is to look at the genetics and to find out what the numbers are. But hopefully our viewers can see that just running through these scenarios, there's all sorts of possibilities. Taking over a country silently is a lot easier than we think. Now,
just before you go on, Dr. Jeanson, would it be possible by having your DNA looked at, and could they tell from that whether you have that sort of ancestry?
That's exactly what I want to discuss next. Some of our viewers might say, well, I've taken a DNA test. I know some of my colleagues here at Answers in Genesis have. They might say, I already know the answer to your question. I can tell you that I'm of European ancestry, and I can tell you whether or not African shows up in my DNA. Well, let's look at that to see what some of these popular tests can actually tell us. Some of the major companies today include Family Tree DNA. I've actually spoken to folks there. 23andMe, Ancestry DNA. Any one of these major companies, our viewers may have already submitted a spit sample, a blood sample to, and they've said, well, here's your ancestry. How much can these tests actually tell you? You give them $100. Do you actually learn anything beyond what you already know? Well, this kind of goes back to what we discussed in the previous episode, but instead of thinking in terms of visible features, like is their skin light-skinned or dark-skinned, I want to think about this family tree, my family tree, hypothetical family tree, in terms of genetic percentage, because that's what one of these companies is going to mail back to you. They're going to say, okay, we sequenced your DNA. Now you're of 20% British, 70% German. These are the sorts of results they're going to report to you. Well, let's think about what happens here. Let's say that this African man is part of my family tree, but is in a dominant light-skinned group. Everyone else in this tree is light-skinned. We saw how that changes the skin tone of the descendants. What about the genetics? Let's say this man is 100% African at the genetic level. Well, if he marries a Caucasian lady, those children are going to be 50% at the genetic level African. It's probably a best case scenario. Dark-skinned man marries a light-skinned lady, children are 50% African, because they get half their DNA from mom, half their DNA from dad. Well, now, next generation, what happens? Again, in my family tree, it's likely another Caucasian person. So that 50% African child grows up, marries a 100% Caucasian person. Now their children, in other words, the grandchildren of this dark-skinned man, are going to be 25% African at the genetic level. Every generation, it drops by half. So the next generation, this 25% African individual marries another 100% Caucasian person. Now the children are 12.5%. You get down to me, I'm only 6.25% African at the genetic level. Well, you might say, see, you can still detect this. Well, drop it, 3% is the next generation. It drops off very fast. Here's the practical reality that many people don't know. These commercial genetic testing companies do not look at your entire DNA sequence unless you pay them a lot of money. Your $100 test isn't going to look at your whole DNA sequence. It's only going to look at the subset that tends to vary. That's the first thing to consider. Second thing to consider is what these companies call African, Caucasian, British, Chinese. It's all proprietary, and it differs, best we know, between these various companies, and you might actually get different results. And I have a colleague who said, hey, I had my parents tested and I got tested and something showed up that wasn't present in my parents. Well, that's, and they used a variety of companies, 2 different companies. That's what happens. That's a practical reflection of this. The biggest factor, though,
those aren't really that accurate then.
Below 10%, practically what this means is below 10% tends not to be reliable. The biggest factor that we'll probably discuss in much more detail when we talk about Adam and Eve is there's a tremendous amount of DNA sharing. Why that exists is another topic for another day. But as an example, Ken and I might differ at a certain number of our DNA positions, certain number of our DNA letters. Well, those positions, those letters where Ken and I differ, I might actually have in common with a dark-skinned African man. And where the dark-skinned African man and I differ at the DNA letters, I might actually have in common with the Chinese. There's a huge amount of DNA sharing despite these visible differences in skin tone, eye shape, and so forth. So what even mainstream geneticists have been talking about is that it looks like the genetics behind the so-called races represent just a small fraction of our DNA. For our purposes in this discussion, because that's a whole other discussion for another day, it becomes that much more difficult to assign at the genetic level the label African. How can you say this is African DNA if he shares it with people around the globe? That's what makes it so difficult. That's probably the biggest factor in the uncertainty in these genetic analyses. So basically what I'm saying is, if you've taken a DNA test, paid $100, you probably haven't learned much more from what you already know in your family tree, 3-4 generations. And if you want to know if most of Europe is of African descent, the $100 test isn't going to tell you. You're going to have to look somewhere else, which is something we'll discuss in subsequent episodes. It's DNA tests you can't find in the mainstream. They're going to tell you much deeper history. So to answer the question of who you came from, your family tree DNA test, your $100 Ancestry.com, or one of these other commercial genetic testing companies, that's not going to tell you who you came from beyond just a few generations. So it's quite possible, given what most people know today about their genetic history, it's quite possible that most of Europe is of recent African descent. We're going to have to look elsewhere at a different type of DNA test to figure out whether or not this is true. What we've seen today, though, is to take over a country is a lot easier than we think. All it takes is a slight difference in reproductive rates that's virtually unnoticeable, and boom, you can have most of Europe be of recent African descent and at the same time be of light-skinned. So you look at history, the things we take for granted, the things we assume are true, may be very different from reality. That's what we can see today, and what we saw before, of course, was that at the genetic level, looking at how genetics works, racial, ethnic change can happen a whole lot faster than we think. We know that our family trees must be much more connected than we think. We know that going back in history, the world is much smaller than we think. And so, however you might answer the question, who do we come from? There's a whole lot more possibilities at play than probably when you first started watching this. So, this is the new history of the human race. There's a whole lot more left to discuss. There's a lot of history we've yet to dive into, but I trust this has expanded our viewers' realm of possibilities as they think about the history of the human race.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating. I gather you're not going to be a marketing guru for some of these DNA companies then.
Maybe not for them, but I anticipate many of our viewers will eventually ask us, well, what does it mean? And I hope that as we go through this series, they'll be able to make some sense of their own DNA results. But there's huge potential here for understanding who we came from in a way that's different from the typical companies. In fact, I've been discussing with people internally, do we start Ancestry and Genesis to help people understand who they came from? Because the mainstream genetic testing companies, because they're looking at DNA that's inherited from both parents, can't tell you much beyond a few generations. And then if we look at other DNA compartments, they're assuming a hundreds of thousands of year time scale. And so in theory, even if evolution were true, they couldn't tell you anything but the deepest history. So the history of civilization is virtually inaccessible to the evolutionist by the way they've concocted their ideas. And what we'll see is, and not to give too much away, the 6,000 year time scale is really the hero of this story. It opens up the history of the human race and it radically rewrites it.
Wow, this is going to be fascinating. I can't wait till that book comes out. I think it's just going to blow people's minds. So we've done part 1, 2, 3, and 4, and people can go to our Answers in Genesis YouTube channel where they'll be archived. And then next week, Saturday night, Sunday night, we will do part 5 and part 6. So how many parts do you think there'll be overall, Dr. Jeanson?
Oh, we might get up to 15, 20. There's just so many crazy things to discuss here. We'll be here for a while, and I hope that the content is as radical as we're selling. It's radically rewritten how I view history, and I trust it'll do the same for our viewers.
I've never heard anyone do it like this ever. So this is really unique, and God's given you a phenomenal gift. So with
Amen.
that, we will be back next week, Saturday night and Sunday night, 7 o'clock, for parts 5 and part 6. In the new history of the human race, we're much more related than we think, and all these changes take much less time than we think. Really fascinating. So thank you, Dr. Jeanson.
Thank you.